The radio on the kitchen sideboard did not play music. It played no news bulletins, no weather reports, no crackling broadcasts from the valley below. It hummed. It was a heavy, wooden-case transistor radio, a Philco model from the early 1950s. Its brass dial scarred by fingernails and black grease. The pointer was jammed permanently between 88 and 90 megahertz, stuck in the dead air where no station broadcast. What came out of the woven fabric speaker was a constant, rhythmic hiss. That sounded like dry salt sliding down an iron chute. Elena stood over the zinc sink, washing 2 tin plates in a basin of tepid water. She scrubbed with a wad of dried horsehair, her movement slow and rhythmic, synchronized with the pulsing static behind her. Outside the small, square window, the town of Iron Ridge sat under a perpetual blanket of gray. It was not fog, and it was not sea mist. It was mine dust, fine, microscopic particles of crushed slate and cold dust that hung suspended in the air from dawn until dusk, coating the pine siding of the cabins and dulling the light of the sun into a pale, copper coin. Elena dried her hands on her apron and turned toward the table. Sitting on the low wooden bench was her 10-year-old brother, Leo. He wore a patchwool cardigan that was 3 sizes too large for him, his small knees pulled up to his chest. In his lap rested a wooden box filled with colored wax crayons. "Leo," Elena said softly, stepping over to him, "eat your porridge before it goes cold." Leo didn't reach for the bowl. He held up a crayon, squinting at the paper wrapper in the dim amber light of the kerosene lamp. "Elena?" he asked. His voice was small, dry as paper shavings. "Yes, Leo." "Which one is the yellow one?" Elena stopped. A cold, familiar stone settled deep in her stomach. She sat down on the bench beside him, taking the crayon from his small, thin fingers. The wax cylinder was wrapped in bright paper printed with the word sunflower. To Elena, the paper was a vivid golden yellow. But when she looked at Leo's eyes, she saw only a milky gray film reflecting the dull light of the room. "It's this one, Leo," she murmured, holding the crayon up to his face. "The one that smells like lard and honey. Remember?" Leo took the crayon back, turning it over in his hand. He didn't look at the tip. He held it up to the wall, drawing a single straight line across the rough pine planks. Where the yellow wax met the wood, Leo didn't see color. To him, the mark was simply a shade of gray, slightly darker than the wood, but paler than the shadows in the corner. "The room looks like ash today, Elena," Leo whispered, his thumb trailing over the wax line. "Everything is the same gray. The stove, the table, your dress, even the trees outside. The sun will come up higher after noon." Elena lied smoothly, pulling the wool cardigan tighter around his shoulders. "It's just the mine dust hanging low in the notch. It always looks gray in the morning." "The man on the porch next door doesn't have a face," Leo added, his voice completely flat, devoid of fear. Elena froze. "What?" "Old Man Miller," Leo said, pointing his small finger toward the window that faced the gravel road. "He's sitting on his porch rocking chair, but his face is smooth, like a river stone." Elena stood up quickly, walking to the front window. She pulled the yellowed muslin curtain aside an inch. Across the narrow gravel track, sitting on the porch of Cabin 14, was Mr. Miller. He was a retired timberman who had spent 40 years hauling pit props down into the shafts. He sat perfectly still in his wooden rocker, his hands resting on his knees. As Elena watched, the radio on her sideboard gave a sharp, violent pop. Crack hiss. Across the street, Miller did not turn his head. But the shadow behind his chair, the long, dark shape cast by his body against the pine wall, shifted. The shadow did not move with Miller. It leaned forward independently, stretching 2 long, thin, jointed arms out toward the road, as if reaching for the latch on Elena's front gate. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned on her heel, strode across the linoleum floor, and reached for the volume knob on the Philco transistor. She twisted it clockwise. The static flared louder. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. The sharp, abrasive hiss of dead frequency filled every corner of the small kitchen, rattling the tin plates in the sink and vibrating the glass chimneys of the wall lamps. Out on the street, the shadow behind Miller's chair flinched. The The long, jointed arms snapped back into the wall, collapsing back into the dark shape of the rocking chair. Elena leaned her forehead against the warm wood of the radio cabinet, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Rule 1, she repeated to herself like a catechism learned in childhood. Keep the dial on 90. Never let the static drop. Rule 2, her mind whispered, the noise keeps the echoes outside the threshold. Never turn the volume down after dark. Elena? Leo called from the table. The box is getting louder. It's keeping the air clean, Leo, Elena said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. She wiped a hand across her face, smelling the bitter scent of copper dust and old oil on her sleeve. It keeps the noise steady. My ears hurt, Leo murmured, leaning his head down onto his arms on the wooden table. The box sounds like people whispering under the river. It's just static, Leo, Elena said, stepping back to the table and stroking his soft, pale hair. Just static. She looked back out the window. The mine dust was thickening, drifting down from the high granite ridge above the town like gray flour. Through the haze, every cabin along the road sat quiet, their chimneys belching thin threads of pale smoke. And from every single open window along the street came the same dry, rasping roar. Dozens of old transistor radios, playing the exact same dead frequency into the silent valley. No dogs barked in Iron Ridge. No birds sang in the stunted pines. There was only the town, the ash, and the roar of 50 radios holding the shadows at bay. By noon, the sun was a faint, brassy smudge behind a layer of mine dust hanging over Iron Ridge. The air smelled of sulfur, iron filings, and cold slag. Every surface. The timber steps of the company's store, the rusted handrails along the creek bed, the leaves of the stunted hemlocks, was covered in a velvety coating of gray dust that muffled every step. Elena walked down the center of Church Street, her basket clutched tightly under her arm. She wore a heavy woolen shawl over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the gravel road ahead. On either side of the street, the cabins stood in neat, identical rows, built from dark cedar planks by the Iron Ridge Mining Company 80 years ago. From every porch, from every open kitchen window, came the sound. SHHHHHHHHHH. 50 transistor radios, tuned to the exact same frequency, merged into a single, overwhelming wall of white noise that echoed off the sheer granite cliffs of the notch. It sounded like a massive, invisible waterfall plunging through the center of the town, washing over the timber roofs and drowning out the quiet. Elena stopped outside cabin 22. An old woman, Mrs. Gable, was standing on her front porch holding a straw broom. She was sweeping the gray dust off her top step, her movement stiff and mechanical. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gable," Elena called out, raising her voice to be heard over the roar of the radio sitting on Gable's porch table. Mrs. Gable didn't turn her head immediately. She completed 3 more sweeps of the broom. Scrape, 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 before her neck jerked around. Her skin was the color of wet newsprint, mapped with fine, dark veins that looked like coal dust trapped beneath the surface. Her eyes were dull, translucent gray marbles that didn't seem to focus on Elena's face, but rather on a point 2 inches behind her ear. "The air is heavy today, Elena," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was thin, dry, and flat, lacking any cadence or rise. "The ridge is breathing." "Yes, ma'am," Elena said. "Is Mr. Gable coming down from the pit today?" Mrs. Gable stopped sweeping. She looked toward the high granite ridge to the north, where the dark, gaping mouth of shaft number 4 cut into the mountain wall. "He's on the night shift," Mrs. Gable murmured. "He's been on the night shift for a long time. He'll be back when the whistle blows." Elena's throat felt dry. Mr. Gable had gone down into shaft number 4 when Elena was a small girl. She couldn't remember his face, but she remembered his boots, heavy, iron-toed work boots that used to sit on the Gable porch. The boots were still there, sitting by the door, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed gray dust. "Keep your dial turned up, child," Mrs. Gable added, her eyes drifting back to the wall of the cabin. "The static is thin near the creek today. The echoes were scraping against my floorboards during the 3rd watch." "I will, Mrs. Gable," Elena said softly. She walked quickly toward the edge of town, where the gravel road gave way to the steep, rutted service trail that led up to the old fire lookout. She needed to check the battery supply at the central relay shack. The town had no power lines running in from the outside world. Every cabin relied on heavy lead-acid batteries recharged by a water turbine in the creek. If a battery failed, if a radio went dark for even 5 minutes, Elena shuddered, pulling her shawl tighter. Rumble. The sound was subtle at first, a low, mechanical throbbing that didn't belong to the valley. It was not the dry rasp of the radios, nor the heavy thud of the mine crushers that hadn't run in decades. It was an engine, a modern fuel-injected engine. Elena spun around, her heart catching in her chest. Down at the southern entrance of the valley, where the gravel road emerged from the narrow rock cut, a vehicle was crawling through the gray dust. It was a modern white pickup truck, with bright blue decals on the doors, reading Pacific Northwest Telecom Field Survey. On the roof, a rack of silver equipment, satellite dishes, directional antennas, and glowing digital sensors, spelled out a world that Elena had only read about in old newspapers. The truck moved slowly, its tires crunching through the deep drifts of mine dust. Inside the cab, David sat behind the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather wrap. He was 28, wearing a bright red fleece jacket and a baseball cap. On the dashboard, his digital navigation unit was flashing violently in red. GPS signal lost. Cellular tower disconnected. Error code 404. Topographic mismatch. Come on, work, David muttered, tapping the glass touchscreen with a gloved thumb. The digital map was glitching continuously, the blue location marker spinning in wild circles over an area labeled Unmapped Sector, former mining reserve. I'm 3 miles off Interstate 90, David said to himself, his voice echoing loudly inside the quiet cab. There shouldn't even be a road here. He looked through the windshield. The world outside was an eerie, low-contrast gray. The massive granite cliffs rose on both sides, blocking out the sky, and the dust hanging in the air was so thick he had to keep his windshield wipers wiping at a slow, intermittent crawl. Squeak wipe, then, as he rolled past a rusted iron sign marking the town limit, "Welcome to Iron Ridge." POP 412, the sound hit him. It didn't come from his truck radio. It came from the air itself, rushing in through the climate control vents. SHHHHHHHHHH. A wall of harsh, grating static slammed into his ears. It was so loud, so dense, that David winced, pulling his hand away from the steering wheel to cover his left ear. "What the hell is that?" David gasped, hitting the button to roll up his side window. The glass slid into the rubber seal, but the noise barely faded. It wasn't just in the air. It felt like a physical vibration humming through the steel frame of his truck, rattling the spare tools in the truck bed. He rounded the final curve of the road and came to a stop in the center of Church Street. The white pickup truck, with sleek lines and glowing LED headlights, looked like an alien spacecraft parked in a graveyard. David stared out the window in absolute disbelief. The wooden cabins, the gravel road, the dark hemlock trees, everything looked like an old black and white photograph that had been buried in ash. And standing along the sidewalks, sitting on their porches, were people. They weren't moving. Overalls, staring at his white truck with eyes that held no curiosity, no fear, and no life. David's boots hit the gravel with a soft, muffled crunch that sounded dull and dead in the thick air. The moment he stepped out of the truck cab, the smell hit him. A dry, metallic reek of sulfur, cold slag, and iron oxide that burned the back of his throat. He pulled his red fleece jacket tight against the chill, his eyes sweeping over the quiet row of timber cabins. The wall of static was deafening. It hit his ears like the roar of a jet engine idling in an enclosed hangar. "Hey!" David called out, raising a gloved hand toward a group of men standing near the company store porch. "Hey, can anyone tell me what pass this is? My GPS is completely dead." The men didn't answer. They didn't even turn their heads. They stood in a loose circle, dressed in heavy duck canvas coats and salt-crusted work boots, their faces pale and dusted with fine gray powder. Their eyes were fixed on the rusted iron wheel of a mine car, sitting on a display pedestal, completely unblinking. David took a step toward them, reaching into his pocket to pull out his handheld spectrum analyzer, a heavy, ruggedized digital device used for mapping cellular interference. The high-definition color screen flickered to life, glowing with bright blue and yellow signal graphs. But as David pointed the sensor probe toward the nearest cabin, the digital displays began to distort. The color spectrum bars collapsed into a single, erratic gray waveform. The digital frequency counter spun wildly through numbers before freezing on a single, impossible value. 0 megahertz, null carrier. What the... David muttered, tapping the heavy plastic housing. The receiver is picking up an RF floor, but there's no modulation. It's just pure thermal noise. You shouldn't be here, a voice said. David jumped, spinning around on his heel. Elena was standing 5 feet behind him on the gravel road, her basket tucked firmly under her arm. Her dark hair was tied back with faded ribbon, her face pale, but her eyes held a sharp, intense clarity that stood out terrifyingly against the gray apathy of the townspeople around them. Jesus, David gasped, taking a step back. You startled me. I'm David. I'm a field survey engineer for Pacific Northwest Telecom. I took a wrong turn off the state route back, near the gorge cut. Turn your truck off, Elena interrupted, her voice flat, urgent and sharp. David blinked, frowning. What? Why? The engine, Elena said, pointing a thin finger at the white pickup truck idling in the middle of the street. The ignition coils, they're sparking. It's making a click in the air. You're cutting into the frequency. It's a standard electronic ignition, David said, a nervous, baffled laugh escaping his chest. Look, miss, I just need directions back to Interstate 90. My navigation system went down 3 miles back, and my radio is picking up massive broadband interference from whatever you guys are running here. He pointed toward the Philco radio sitting on the porch of cabin 18, its wooden cabinet vibrating violently as it blasted dead air into the road. What is that? David demanded, raising his voice over the noise. Is that a jammer? Are you running an unauthorized broadcast array up on the ridge? Elena didn't answer his question. She stepped past him, her eyes fixed on the dashboard of his truck. Through the open driver's door, she could see the glowing blue touchscreen of his digital navigation unit. The bright artificial light cast a vivid blue square across the gray gravel, a color so intense, so vibrant, that it looked like a tear in the fabric of the world. From the shadow beneath the truck's rear axle, something moved. It was not a person. It was a long, dark, featureless shape, a silhouette cast by no sun, sliding silently across the dust toward the blue glow of the screen. Elena's eyes went wide. She lunged forward, reaching through the open truck window, and slammed her palm down on the engine ignition button. Click! The truck engine died instantly. The glowing blue touchscreen flickered and went dark. Hey! What are you doing? David shouted, rushing forward to grab the truck door handle. Look down, Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she held her breath. David stopped, looking down at his boots. The dark shadow under the rear axle froze, deprived of the bright blue screen light. The shape seemed to lose its cohesion, dissolving slowly back into gray dust until it was nothing more than a faint smudge beneath the differential housing. David stared at the ground, his chest heaving, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the dust up to Elena's face. What was that? David stammered, his technical confidence evaporating into the cold air. That wasn't an optical shadow. The sun is behind the ridge. That was an echo, Elena said quietly, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. They come out when the air gets clean. They come out when people bring noise that doesn't belong here. She turned and looked down the long, gray row of Church Street. At the far end of the road, sitting on his small wooden bench outside cabin 10, 10-year-old Leo was holding a gray crayon. He had turned his head toward David's truck, his pale, milky eyes staring straight at David with absolute, unseeing stillness. You need to come inside, Elena said, taking David by the sleeve of his red fleece coat. Her fingers felt cold as ice through the fabric. Before the sun drops behind the granite, if you're out here when the static shifts, you won't make it back to your truck. The door of cabin 10 slammed shut, and Elena immediately threw the heavy iron bolt across the frame. The interior of the cabin was dark, smelling of dried chamomile with ash and cold tallow. The only light came from a single kerosene wall lamp whose flame burned a pale, weak amber. And filling every cubic inch of the small room was the roar of the Philco transistor radio on the sideboard. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. Inside the small timber room, the sound felt physical, a dense, oppressive blanket of white noise that vibrated in David's teeth and made his ears ring with a dull, throbbing ache. "Do you have to keep that thing turned up so loud?" David shouted over the noise, pressing his hands against his ears. "My head is pounding." "It stays on 90, Elena said coldly, not turning around. She picked up a small tin can of brass polish in a rag, wiping down the radio's control dials with meticulous care. If the static drops below 60 decibels, the shadows start creeping through the floorboards. David took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He pulled off his baseball cap and looked around the room. Sitting at the wooden kitchen table was the small boy, Leo. He didn't flinch at the deafening roar of the radio. He sat perfectly still, holding a wooden crayon box in his lap. David walked over to the table, stepping carefully over the creaking pine floorboards. He crouched down beside the boy, trying to adopt a gentle, reassuring tone. "Hey, buddy," David said, forcing a smile. "My name's David. You must be Elena's brother." Leo turned his head slowly. His milky, translucent gray eyes stared right past David's face, looking at the bright red fleece of his jacket. "Your coat doesn't have a name," Leo whispered. His voice was flat, dry, and soft, like sand trickling through an hourglass. David frowned, looking down at his bright fleece jacket. "What do you mean?" "It's red. Red like a fire engine." Leo reached out a small, trembling hand, his fingers stopping an inch from the fabric. He didn't touch it. "It looks like cold salt," Leo said quietly. "Everything looks like salt today. Elena told me there are colors outside, but I think she's lying. The world is just gray dust and noise." David felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal smartphone. He tapped the screen, bringing up a vibrant, high-contrast photo of an autumn forest, vivid reds, brilliant yellows, and deep greens glowing under a bright blue sky. "Look at this, Leo," David said, holding the screen toward the boy. "Look at the trees. See the red leaves? See the gold?" Leo leaned forward, squinting at the glowing glass screen. For a second, the reflection of the bright colors danced in the milky film over his eyes. But as David watched in horror, the vibrant colors on the screen began to bleed away. The deep red shifted to dull charcoal. The gold turned to washed-out cream. The bright blue sky faded into the exact slate-gray color of the mine dust hanging outside the window. "It's just salt, mister," Leo murmured, turning his head back toward his crayon box. "It's all just gray." David pulled the phone back, staring at the screen in disbelief. On his display, the digital photo was completely desaturated, a black-and-white image of a dead forest. "What is happening here?" David gasped, spinning around to face Elena. What is wrong with his eyes? What is wrong with this entire town? Elena set her polishing rag down on the sideboard. She walked over to the table, leaning her hands against the rough timber top, her eyes fixed on David with a chilling, desperate intensity. "This town doesn't exist on your maps anymore, David," Elena whispered, her voice barely cutting to the radio's rasp. David let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd. I drove here on a gravel service road. I'm standing in a wooden house. You're breathing. I'm breathing. Are you?" Elena interrupted, her eyes narrowing. David stopped. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his chest. Beneath his bright red fleece, his heart was beating fast. He could feel the panic thumping behind his ribs. But as he looked down at his gloved hands resting on the wooden table, he noticed something he hadn't seen outside in the bright glare of the dust. His shadow, cast by the pale amber light of the kerosene lamp. David threw a sharp, dark shadow across the pine floorboards. Elena didn't. She stood between the kerosene lamp and the wall. But behind her, the pine planks were completely clear. The yellow light passed through her skirt, through her shawl, through her dark hair, casting no shadow at all upon the wood. David stumbled backward, his knees slamming into the bench, sending a wooden chair clattering to the floor. "Jesus Christ!" David choked out, pressing his back against the heavy wooden front door. You don't have a shadow?" "None of us do. Elena said softly, stepping closer to him. Not anymore. We haven't had shadows since the sirens blew. From the radio on the sideboard came a sudden, sharp, metallic screech. SCRECH crack. The needle on the brass dial jumped violently from 90 megahertz, drifting down toward 88. The wall of white noise dropped instantly by half, the harsh roar softening into a low, terrifying hum. And from the floorboards directly beneath David's boots came the sound of something cold, thin, and jointed, scraping against the wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The drop in static felt like a sudden plunge in room pressure. Scritch, scritch. Beneath the floorboards, the scratching grew faster, dragging along the joists right under David's heels. A dark, vaporous smudge, like black oil bleeding through pine wood, began to seep through the gap between the floor planks near his boots. The dial, Elena screamed, lunging across the kitchen. She slammed her hands against the Philco radio, grabbing the brass knob and forcing the pointer back up to 90 megahertz. SHHHHHHHHHH. The static exploded back to full volume, vibrating the tin plates on the dresser. The black stain on the floorboards vanished instantly, dissolving into a faint puff of gray dust that was swept away by the air current. David slumped against the door, his heart hammering in his throat, sweat dripping down his temples despite the freezing cold inside the room. "What is that?" David gasped, pointing a trembling hand at the floor. "What is under this house?" Elena didn't answer. She stood over the radio, her chest heaving, keeping her hand pressed tight against the wooden cabinet as if physically holding the frequency in place. David pulled his handheld spectrum analyzer from his jacket pocket. The screen was still glitching, but as he pointed the directional sensor down at the floor, a spike of high-frequency data registered on the buffer memory. "It's not an electrical anomaly," David whispered, staring at the raw signal data scrolling across the screen in small white text. "The sensor is picking up a massive acoustic resonance frequency coming from the bedrock beneath the town, 14.2 kilohertz. He tapped the screen frantically, pulling up his device's offline historical database, a geological and infrastructural archive cache for field operations. Searching local mining archives. Iron Ridge sector. David muttered aloud, his thumb flying across the glass. The screen flickered, then locked onto an old scanned document from 1952. Disaster report. Iron Ridge Mine Shaft No. For October 12, 1952. At 8:14 a.m., a massive pocket of pressurized methane gas was ignited by a faulty spark in the central hoist room of shaft number 4. The resulting subterranean explosion collapsed the main air shafts, sealing all 380 miners underground. The shockwave swept through the surface town, destroying the company housing and killing 32 civilians. No survivors were recovered. David froze. His eyes scanned the black and white digital photo attached to the document. It showed the exact row of timber cabins he was standing in, except they weren't standing intact under a layer of dust. The roofs were caved in, the pine walls splintered into tinder, and a massive plume of black coal smoke was billowing from the shattered earth where Church Street used to be. David looked up slowly from the screen, staring at Elena. October 12, 1952. David whispered, his voice cracking. The mine exploded. The town was wiped off the map 74 years ago. Elena looked at him, her gray eyes completely steady, devoid of shock or surprise. "The sirens blew at 8 in the morning," she said quietly, her voice rising just enough to carry over the radio's roar. "My father was down in the 4th level. Leo and I were sitting right here at this table. You died in the blast," David stammered, backing away until his head touched the cold door frame. "All of you, Mr. Miller, Mrs. Gable, the whole town." "No," Elena said, shaking her head gently. "We didn't die. We just couldn't leave." She looked down at her pale, translucent hands resting on the table. "When the shockwave hit the valley," Elena whispered, "the company's main radio transmitter on the ridge was shattered. Its broadcast tube shorted out, locking the central frequency on dead static. The sound echoed off the granite walls, over and over and over. It was the last thing any of us heard before the dark took us." David stared at her, the horrific reality settling over him like a suffocating shroud. The static wasn't a shield. It wasn't protecting them from the echoes or the shadows. The static was a trap. The shock wave of the explosion had burned the final, panic moment of their deaths into the electromagnetic frequency of the valley. The 50 transistor radios blaring in every cabin weren't keeping the town safe. They were repeating the trauma on an endless, unbreakable loop, trapping their spirits in a frozen, grayscale simulation of the morning they died. Leo picked up a gray crayon from his box, tapping it against a wooden table in time with the radio's hiss. "The man on the screen is gray too, David," Leo said softly. David looked down at his phone. The digital photo of the 1952 disaster on his screen was fading. The text was dissolving into static lines, and the bright red battery icon in the top corner was rapidly draining toward zero. The radios, David realized, his eyes going wide with sudden, terrifying comprehension. If the static is holding the loop together, what happens if you turn them off? Elena stepped between David and the Philco transistor on the sideboard, her arms spread wide, her face pale with sudden, desperate terror. "No!" she cried out. "If the radio goes quiet, the shadows come inside. They take everything. They take Leo." "Elena, look at him!" David yelled, pointing at the boy. "He's losing his sight. He's losing his colors. The loop is eroding you all into dust. You're not living here. You're burning in the same fire every single day." From deep within the valley outside, high up on the granite ridge near shaft number 4, came a sound that made the entire cabin shudder. Oh, it was not the wind. It was the sound of a long-abandoned mine siren, screaming through 40 feet of buried rubble, signaling the start of the final shift. The sound of the mine siren vibrated to the floorboards, a raw, mechanical scream that seemed to tear through the gray air outside. Inside the cabin, the glass chimney of the kerosene lamp shattered with a sharp clink, showering the wooden table with fine shards. The open flame flickered violently, throwing long, distorted shadows across the pine walls, shadows that did not match the shapes of the furniture. "The shift is starting," Elena whispered, her hands gripping the edges of the sideboard. Her face was entirely drained of color now, translucent as tallow. "The air is getting heavy." David sprinted to the window, pulling the muslin curtain aside. Outside on Church Street, the gray mine dust was no longer falling in a gentle mist. It was swirling in wild, violent eddies, driven by a wind that brought no cold, only in suffocating heat smelling of scorched coal and sweet, sickly methane gas. Down the center of the road, the townspeople were moving. They walked in a stiff, mechanical line toward the dark mouth of shaft number 4 on the ridge. Old Man Miller, Mrs. Gable, the timbermen in their canvas coats. Their faces were completely blank, their eyes turned upward toward the mountain wall. They walked straight through the deep drifts of dust, leaving no footprints in the ground. And behind each walking figure, stretched long across the gravel, were the echoes. They were dense, pitch-black silhouettes, reaching out with elongated, multi-jointed arms, trying to touch the heels of the walking townspeople. The only thing keeping the shadows from wrapping around their ankles was the deafening roar of the transistor radios sitting on every porch, screaming dead air into the storm. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. "They're walking into the shaft, David." Elena cried out, her voice breaking into a terrified sob. "Every night, when the siren blows, they walk back into the mountain. And every night, the static brings them back to their porches before the blast." David turned back to the room, his eyes wild with desperation. He pointed his spectrum analyzer at the Philco radio on the sideboard. On the screen, the waveform was spiking uncontrollably. The 14.2 kilohertz acoustic resonance was vibrating at such a high frequency that small cracks were forming along the wooden frame of the radio itself. "Elena, listen to me," David shouted, grabbing her by her cold shoulders. "The radio isn't protecting you. It's replaying the disaster. It's keeping all of you trapped in the exact 60 seconds before the methane ignited." "No!" she screamed, trying to push his hands away. "If I turn it off, we burn." "You already burned," David yelled back, his voice echoing off the pine logs. 74 years ago. You're holding on to the noise because you're afraid of the quiet, but the quiet is the only thing that ends a loop. Leo stood up from the wooden table. The wooden box of crayons fell from his lap, spilling across the floorboards. The wax cylinders didn't roll. They lay motionless where they hit, every single one of them stripped of its color, looking like small gray chalk sticks in the dust. Leo walked slowly toward David. He raised his small, pale face, his milky eyes staring straight into David's chest. "David," Leo whispered. "I'm here, Leo," David said, dropping to his knees so he was eye level with the boy. "The noise is too loud," Leo murmured. He reached up with his small, translucent hands and pressed his palms over his ears. "It hurts inside my head. It sounds like the mountain falling over and over again. I want to see the yellow crayon again, David. I don't want to see the salt anymore." Elena froze, her hand hovering an inch above the radio's brass volume dial. She looked from her little brother's small, weeping form down to her own hand. In the harsh, flickering light of the bare kerosene flame, her fingers were losing their definition. The edges of her skin were dissolving into fine, gray dust that wafted away into the vibrating air of the room. "Leo," Elena choked out, tears of silver light welling in her translucent eyes. You can't see the yellow?" "It's gone, Elena," Leo whimpered softly. "Everything is gone. Only the box making the noise is left." From the sideboard behind them, the Philco transistor let out a deep, gut-wrenching groan of strain. Creak-crack. The wooden casing split down the side. A wisp of black, oily smoke curled out from the woven speaker fabric, smelling of melted copper and scorched insulation. The dial pointer began to slide down the scale on its own. 89, 88, 87, and outside the front door, the scratching on the threshold turned into a heavy, rhythmic pounding that rattled the iron bolt in its keeper. The iron bolt on the front door sheared in half with a loud, metallic snap. The heavy oak door swung inward, slamming against the pine wall. A wave of suffocating, superheated air surged into the cabin. Air thick with the reek of raw methane, burnt pine, and sulfur. The gray mine dust outside swirled across the threshold like a living tide, spilling over the floorboards in dark, heavy ripples. Standing in the open doorway was a figure. It was Old Man Miller. He stood framed against the copper-gray sky, his canvas coat charred black around the collar. His face was no longer smooth like a river stone. It was a void of shifting gray ash, two hollow sockets where his eyes should have been, flickering with tiny, cold embers of subterranean fire. Behind him, stretching out down the length of Church Street, stood the rest of the townspeople. They stood motionless in the dust, their mouths open in a silent, collective scream that produced no sound. Only the overwhelming, ear-splitting roar of the 50 radios blaring across the valley. Miller took a step across the threshold. Where his boot touched the floorboards, the pine would turn instantly to black charcoal, crumbling into powder under his weight. "Elena," Miller's voice didn't come from his throat. It vibrated directly out of the Philco radio on the sideboard, mixed with a harsh rasp of static. "The shift is ending. Come to the hoist." David grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the cold stove, stepping between Miller and the boy. "Get back," David yelled, his voice strained and hoarse. "Get out." He swung the poker through the air. The heavy iron rod passed clean through Miller's chest as if he were made of thick smoke. The figure didn't flinch. It simply leaned forward, its translucent, ash-dusted hand reaching toward David's face. As Miller's fingers drew within an inch of David's skin, a wave of intense, numbing cold washed over him. The red fleece of David's jacket began to lose its color, fading instantly to dull, chalky gray where Miller's shadow touched it. "David!" Elena screamed. She looked at her brother Leo, who was kneeling on the floorboards, his small hands pressed tight over his ears, his body trembling violently as the static roared around them. Then she looked at the radio. The Philco transistor was smoking heavily now. The brass dial was glowing dull red from internal heat, the needle trembling violently at 87 megahertz. The static was changing, no longer just white noise, but turning into the agonizing, synthesized sound of tearing metal, collapsing timber, and the distant muffled thud and explosion subterranean shockwave repeating every 3 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. "It's not keeping us safe," Elena whispered, the realization finally breaking through decades of conditioned fear. Her voice was barely audible above the din, but held a sudden, terrifying clarity. It's just the blast, over and over. She stepped past David, walking straight toward the smoking radio. Old Man Miller's ash figure turned its hollow face toward her, reaching out a jointed arm to block her path. Elena, don't touch the dial. Elena didn't hesitate. She looked down at her hands, translucent, pale, and fading at the edges. She looked at Leo, whose eyes were fixed on the floor, waiting for the noise to stop. I'm sorry, Leo, Elena said softly, a peaceful, silver tear trailing down her cheek, leaving a clean mark through the gray dust on her face. I'm sorry I made you stay in the dark for so long. She reached out with both hands and grabbed the hot wooden cabinet of the Philco transistor that would scorch her palms, but she didn't let go. With a single, sharp, decisive motion, Elena turned the volume dial counterclockwise, slamming it all the way to the left. Click, click. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was an explosive, violent vacuum that sucked the air straight out of the cabin. For a single heartbeat, the universe held its breath. The deafening roar of white noise, the metallic grinding of the floorboards, the rhythmic subterranean thud of the 1952 explosion, all of it vanished, cut clean like a snapped cable. Out on Church Street, the 50 transistor radios blaring from every porch went dead in unison. Old Man Miller froze in the doorway. His arm, raised to block Elena, stopped midair. The flickering embers of cold fire in his eye sockets dimmed and went dark. Then, the static loop began to dissolve. It did not end with fire or smoke. It began with the dust. The heavy, suffocating gray mine dust that had hung over Iron Ridge for 74 years began to soften, turning from harsh, granular grit into a warm, shimmering mist. High above the valley, the slate-gray sky cracked open, letting in a sudden, brilliant shaft of late afternoon sunlight. David gasped, shielded his eyes from the blinding glare. As the sunlight hit the floor of the cabin, the gray world began to flood with color. It came back like ink spreading through pure water, a sudden, vibrant wave of deep cedar brown, warm copper kerosene light, and rich pine wood grain. At the table, Leo slowly lowered his hands from his ears. He blinked, gasping as his milky, translucent eyes cleared, revealing brilliant, deep hazel pupils reflecting the golden sunlight streaming through the window. Leo looked down at the floorboards. Elena, Leo whispered, his voice trembling with a pure, childlike wonder. Elena, look. Spread across the pine floorboards, the spilled crayons were no longer dull gray chalk. They glowed under the sunlight, vivid crimson, deep forest green, sky blue, and right at his feet, the wax cylinder wrapped in bright, golden paper. The sunflower. Leo choked out, reaching down to pick up the yellow crayon. He held it up to his face, tears streaming down his cheeks. It's yellow, Elena. It's yellow. Elena fell to her knees beside her brother, wrapping her arms around him, weeping silver tears of overwhelming relief. As she held him, her body, and the body of Old Man Miller standing in the doorway, began to glow with a soft, warm radiance. They were no longer translucent or fading at the edges. They looked whole, peaceful, and warm, as if the burden of 74 years of fear had been lifted from their shoulders in an instant. Out on the street, the townspeople turned away from the dark mouth of shaft number 4. They looked at their hands, at the blue sky above the granite ridge, and at each other. The dark, jointed shadows behind them did not attack. They simply evaporated into the warm air like morning dew under the sun. Thank you, David, Elena said, looking up at David with a smile that carried the quiet beauty of a long-awaited dawn. David stood frozen by the door, tears welling in his eyes as he watched the cabin walls begin to thin, turning into a warm, golden mist that smelled of wild pine, chamomile, and summer grass. Where are you going? David asked softly, his voice full of emotion. Past the ridge, Elena whispered, taking Leo by the hand. The shift is finally over. Leo looked up at David, holding up his yellow crayon one last time with a bright, joyful grin. Good luck with your truck, David. The warm light expanded, engulfing the cabin, the street, and the town in a brilliant, painless flash of white, before fading slowly into the absolute stillness of the mountain air. When David opened his eyes, the roar was gone. The superheated air, the smell of methane, and the suffocating gray mine dust had completely evaporated. In their place was the sharp, biting cold of a real November mountain afternoon, crisp and clean, smelling of alpine firs and damp earth. David was lying on his back in a clearing of crushed granite and wild, overgrown brambles. High above him, the sheer rock walls of the notch framed a bright, clear blue sky. Sunbeams cut through the pine canopy, casting long, golden geometric shadows across the ground. David sat up slowly, his lungs gasping as he pulled cold, clean oxygen deep into his chest. His hands were shaking, his knuckles coated in plain brown dirt, not gray coal dust. "Elena," he called out, his voice echoing loudly off the canyon walls. "Leo." No one answered. There was only the gentle rustle of wind through the hemlock branches and the distant, cheerful gurgle of Mountain Creek rushing over clean river stones. David pushed himself up onto his feet, looking around the clearing. The rows of wooden timber cabins were gone. Church Street was gone. The company store, the porch where Old Man Miller had sat, the wooden bench where Leo had drawn, all of it had vanished. In their place sat the true, untouched ruins of the 1952 disaster. Rotting pine logs, buried under 74 years of moss and wild ivy, lay scattered across the forest floor. Rusted iron structural beams, twisted and buckled by an ancient blast, peeked out from beneath thick carpets of green ferns. Where mouth of shaft number 4 had once gaped dark and terrifying on a ridge, there was only a massive, peaceful rock slide of moss-covered granite boulders, permanently sealed by time. 50 yards away, sitting in the middle of a clear gravel clearing, stood David's white pickup truck. Its engine was off, its LED headlights dark. David walked over to the vehicle on trembling legs. He opened the driver's door and looked inside. The dashboard touchscreen was dark, but as he pressed the power button, the modern digital display flared to life instantly. GPS signal recovered. Location: Snoqualmie Pass, Sector 4 service cut. Time: 16:42 p.m. The digital map displayed his exact coordinates. The red location sitting cleanly on a verified forestry road. The offline error code were gone. The cellular spectrum analyzer sitting on the passenger seat read a steady, normal ambient noise floor of minus 105 dBm. David leaned his forearms against the truck's roof, putting his head down as tears of relief and lingering shock spilled onto his sleeves. Then he stopped. He looked down at his right hand. His red fleece jacket, which had faded to gray under the shadow of the echoes, was once again a bright, vivid crimson, and tucked tightly into the chest pocket of his jacket, right over his heart, was a small, solid object. David reached into his pocket with cold fingers and pulled it out. It was not a digital sensor or a piece of rusted copper wire. It was a single and used wax crayon wrapped in faded golden paper. On the side, printed in bold vintage lettering, was the word sunflower. David held the golden crayon in his palm, letting the bright afternoon sunlight catch its smooth, unmarred surface. It smelled faintly of old wax, lard, and wild honey. He looked back out over the peaceful, sunlit clearing where the ghost town of Iron Ridge had stood for 74 years. The static was dead. The frequency was clear, and the lost souls of the ridge had finally walked past the mountain into the light. The sun dipped behind the western jagged peaks of the Cascades, casting long, violet shadows across the service cut. David sat in the driver's seat of his white survey truck, the engine humming smoothly. The digital dashboard glowed with a warm, steady amber light, displaying a clean GPS route back toward Interstate 90. He didn't drive away immediately. He lowered the driver's side window, letting the sharp, pristine mountain air fill the cab. The reek of sulfur, hot copper, and coal methane was completely gone. In its place was the sweet, crisp scent of wild mountain pine and wet granite. David picked up his professional spectrum analyzer from the passenger seat. He tapped the touchscreen, setting the receiver to scan the entire high-frequency radio band from 88 to 108 megahertz. The digital display swept across the frequencies in a smooth, continuous blue line. 88.1 megahertz, clean. 89.5 megahertz, clean. 90.0 megahertz, an oak carrier, ambient floor, minus 110 dBm. The 14.2 kilohertz acoustic resonance that had locked 41 souls in a 74-year loop of trauma was gone. The bedrock beneath the valley was quiet, resting in the deep, natural stillness of the earth. David looked over at the passenger seat. Sitting atop his leather survey logbook was a single wax crayon wrapped in golden paper. Sunflower. The bright yellow wax caught the faint ambient light of the dashboard, vibrant and undeniable. He reached out, touching the paper wrapper gently with his thumb. Elena and Leo had not survived the 1952 methane explosion in the physical sense, but they were no longer burned by its memory. By turning off the Philco transistor, Elena had broken a loop of fear that held their grief locked in the static. They had not been taken by the shadows. They had simply been allowed to finish the shift and step into sunlight. David shifted the truck into drive. The tires crunched softly over the gravel as the vehicle rolled slowly down the winding service trail, leaving the clearing behind. In his rear-view mirror, the setting sun cast its final rays over a quiet mound of mossy granite boulders where shaft number 4 had once gaped dark and foreboding. Growing right at the base of the sealed mine entrance, surrounded by wild ferns and dark pine trees, stood a tiny cluster of wild alpine sunflowers, bright, golden yellow blossoms, swaying gently in the evening mountain breeze. David smiled softly, a deep sense of peace settling over his chest. He turned the truck dial to a local classical station broadcasting from the valley below. A gentle piano melody filled the cab, clear and crisp, without a single trace of static. The ridge was quiet, the signal was clear, and the town of Iron Ridge was finally at rest.